My name is Eleanor, and this lesbian story begins in a time when love had no language for women like me. This is an educational story about how lesbian women lived in the Middle Ages and how we learned to hide feelings that society refused to name. I was born into a world ruled by the church, inheritance laws, and rigid roles for women. Marriage was not a choice, it was a duty. Love, at least the kind written about in songs and sermons, existed only between a man and a woman, and even then, mostly as obligation, not affection. There was no word for what I felt, no book, no confession that could be spoken aloud. What existed instead was silence. As young girls, we were taught obedience before identity. We lived closely with other women, in family homes, convents, workshops, and service quarters. Physical closeness between women was common and unquestioned. Emotional closeness, too. And within that closeness, something deeper could quietly grow. I remember when I first noticed her, not as a friend, not as a sister, but as something unnamed. My heart changed its rhythm when she entered a room. I learned her moods before she spoke. Her absence felt heavier than hunger. This story is educational because medieval society did not recognize lesbian relationships as relationships at all. And paradoxically, that invisibility was both danger and protection. Men wrote laws about men. The church preached sins it could define. But women loving women existed in a gray space, rarely spoken of, rarely understood. That did not mean we were safe. Any woman who refused marriage, who showed too much independence, who formed intense attachments, could be accused of witchcraft, moral corruption, or defiance of God's order. Love did not need to be proven. Suspicion was enough. So we learned survival. We learned to mask affection as devotion. We learned to frame love as service. We learned to hide longing inside prayers, letters, and shared labor. Touch had to look accidental. Glances had to be brief. Words had to mean something else on the surface. And yet, despite fear, connection found a way. Looking back, I understand this. Lesbian love in the Middle Ages did not disappear because it was weak. It survived because it was quiet. This is where my story truly begins. Not with rebellion, but with learning how to love without being seen. This lesbian story continues not in secrecy alone, but in routine. In the Middle Ages, survival depended on blending in. Women's lives followed predictable paths: household labor, service to noble families, work in fields or workshops, or life within religious institutions. These spaces shaped how women like us learned to stay close without being questioned. I lived among women constantly. We cooked together, slept in shared quarters, washed each other's wounds, braided hair, and prayed side by side. Intimacy between women was not unusual. It was expected. That expectation gave us cover. This story is educational because medieval lesbian relationships often survived inside socially acceptable female bonds. Companionship between women was encouraged. Emotional reliance was normal. Even shared beds were practical, not scandalous. No one looked twice, because no one imagined desire could exist there. But desire did exist. We learned to communicate without language. A pause of the hand. A look held half a breath too long. A choice to walk together when paths separated. At night, when candles were low and voices gone, closeness changed meaning. A shoulder became an anchor. Breathing aligned. Silence spoke louder than words ever could. Still, we were careful. Affection had limits. Passion had boundaries enforced not by law, but by fear. There were moments when longing pressed so hard it felt unbearable, yet crossing an invisible line could cost everything. Marriage loomed constantly. For most women, it was unavoidable. Some of us were married to men and continued loving women quietly. Others delayed marriage through illness, religious devotion, or service. A few escaped it entirely by entering convents. Convents, especially, were complex spaces. This story is educational because convents were one of the few places where women lived together without male authority, and where intense emotional bonds were common. The church praised spiritual sisterhood. Deep attachments between nuns were documented in letters filled with longing, devotion, and exclusivity, language that today reads unmistakably romantic. But even there, caution ruled. Too much attachment could be condemned as excess. Too much independence could be punished. Love survived only when framed as holiness, not desire. What sustained us most was not passion, but partnership. We supported each other through illness, grief, childbirth, and loss. In a world that granted women little power, shared loyalty became resistance. We built meaning where none was offered. Looking back, I see this clearly. Lesbian love in the Middle Ages was not lived openly, but it was lived intentionally, not loudly, but persistently. And every day we chose each other, even in silence, was an act of quiet defiance. In the Middle Ages, secrecy was not only emotional, it was strategic. Rumors carried weight. A glance noticed by the wrong person could reshape a life. While there were no clear words for women like us, there was punishment for anything that disrupted order. This story is educational because medieval society did not need a name for lesbian relationships to control them. Suspicion alone was enough. Women were expected to be obedient, modest, and directed toward men. When two women appeared too independent, too devoted to each other, or uninterested in marriage, questions followed. Why does she refuse suitors? Why are they always together? Why does she grieve so deeply when the other is ill? Fear did not come from law alone. It came from community. A whisper could lead to intervention by family. A priest's concern could become confession pressure. A neighbor's jealousy could turn into accusation. Punishments were rarely dramatic executions. They were quieter and more effective. Separation, forced marriage, transfer to another household or convent, public shame framed as moral correction. I saw it happen. One woman was sent away after refusing 3 proposals. Another was married within weeks of being accused of excessive attachment. Letters were confiscated. Shared work was reassigned. Bonds were broken deliberately. This story is educational because control often targeted connection, not behavior. No one needed proof of physical intimacy. Emotional closeness alone was enough to be dangerous. We learned to adapt. Affection became invisible. We praised other women publicly. We argued on purpose. We allowed distance so it would not be imposed. Love survived not through honesty, but through misdirection. There were moments when fear almost erased desire. Yet even then, love found form. A shared object kept secretly. A phrase spoken only once that carried years of meaning. A promise made without witnesses. Some women ran. Very few succeeded. Travel required money, protection, and male permission. Freedom was rare, but longing was constant. The most painful truth I learned was this: love did not disappear because it was forbidden. It disappeared when survival demanded sacrifice. And still, we chose each other when we could, even knowing the cost, even knowing it might end. Because in a world that erased women's autonomy, loving another woman was not just affection, it was identity, it was refusal, it was memory carried forward, even when bodies were separated. Most stories like ours were never written, not because they did not exist, but because survival required silence. History remembers wars, kings, and laws, but it forgets quiet lives that learn to endure without recognition. This story is educational because absence in history does not mean absence in reality. As I grew older, I understood something painful but important. We were not invisible by accident. We were made invisible on purpose. Records erased women's intimacy by redefining it as friendship. Devotion was dismissed as loyalty. Love was reduced to usefulness. When two women lived together, history called it convenience, never choice. Yet memory does not rely on ink alone. I carried her in habits, in gestures passed down without explanation, in stories told carefully, with names changed and meanings hidden. Some women found brief safety in convents, others in widowhood, a few in lifelong companionships that society tolerated because it could not imagine anything else. This story is educational because patriarchy often survives by limiting imagination. If a society cannot imagine love between women, it does not know how to stop it, only how to ignore it. But ignoring does not erase. I learned that resistance does not always look like rebellion. Sometimes it looks like continuity, like choosing to remember when forgetting would be easier, like teaching younger women how to read between rules. What we passed down was subtle. How to recognize longing without words, how to trust carefully, how to love without witnesses. These lessons were not written, they were lived. Today, when people ask whether lesbian relationships existed in the Middle Ages, I answer silently. We existed everywhere silence was required. This story matters because it corrects the idea that queer history is modern. It is not. What is modern is visibility, not love. If you are listening to this story now, know this. You are not new. You are not unnatural. You are part of a lineage that survived without permission. Our lives were quiet. Our love was careful, but it was real. And because it was real, it endured. This is where my story ends, not with disappearance, but with continuation. Because as long as these stories are told, we are no longer hidden.